June 28, 1944. Just outside the small French village of Choux, Normandy. The air hangs thick with humidity and cordite. Rain has turned the fields into a nightmare of sucking mud and shattered hedgerows. Somewhere beyond the distant rumble of artillery, a low mechanical growl rolls through the drizzle. The sound is slow, deliberate, almost hesitant, but it does not stop. It's the sound of a Churchill tank crawling forward inch by inch through the chaos. Inside the tank, the crew of the 7th Royal Tank Regiment are drenched in sweat, despite the cool air. The engine heat and fumes fill the cramped hull. Corporal Ernie Wilkes, the driver, squints through his vision slit. His hands, blackened with grease, grip the levers as the tank lurches over another sodden embankment. Above him, Lieutenant Alan Redford peers through his periscope, trying to make sense of the battlefield. To his left, Gunner Tom Avery adjusts the elevation on the 75mm gun, waiting for the order that could come at any moment. They are part of Operation Epsom, the British push to break out west of Caen. The terrain is nothing like the open deserts where many of these men first fought. Here, in the Norman bocage, the world has closed in. Tall hedgerows hem in every road. Each field is its own fortress, and every corner could hide a German 88. The Churchills advance slowly, painfully. Infantry of the 15th Scottish Division move alongside them, crouched low, rifles ready. The mud grabs at their boots. Mortars thud in the distance, sending wet earth splattering over the tank's armor. Somewhere ahead, a German machine gun bursts to life. Bullets hammer the front plate, sparking harmlessly off the thick steel. Redford ducks instinctively. "Avery, suppress that hedgerow at 1 o'clock," he shouts over the intercom. The gun roars. The recoil shudders through the hull, and a puff of smoke and leaves erupts where the hedgerow once was. For a moment, it's quiet again. Just the slow churning of the tracks, and the rain drumming on the turret. The Churchill is painfully slow. On a good day, it barely manages 15 miles an hour. In this mud, it's crawling at less than half that. But that slowness hides a brutal advantage. Where the faster American Shermans bog down, the Churchill's immense tracks grip and claw through the mire. Its hull is heavy, its suspension built to take punishment. It was a machine born from the disaster at Dunkirk, a tank built not for speed, but survival. Thick armor, wide tracks, and the ability to climb where others stalled. It was ugly, awkward, even mocked by its own crews at first. But today, in Normandy's choking mud, that ugly duckling has become a monster. Redford's crew advances past the hedgerow, their vision momentarily clearing. To their right, a Sherman flounders in a ditch, its engine roaring uselessly as its tracks spin in place. A corporal waves desperately for help. Redford hesitates only a moment before keying his mic. "Ernie, stop. Give him a pull." The Churchill halts. Chains clatter as a tow line is thrown across. Ernie reverses gently, the tank's massive torque dragging the Sherman free like a stranded animal. The American crew waves their thanks, and the two machines press on together, mud splattering over both. Over the radio, static hisses. Then the unmistakable clipped tones of a German commander. "Panzer vorwärts. Halt die Linie." Panzers are moving up. The British infantry hits the dirt. Redford stiffens. He knows what's coming. Through the mist, black silhouettes emerge, squat, angular shapes moving with deadly grace. Panzer IVs. Their turrets swing slowly, searching for targets. A moment later, the fields explode with cannon fire. A Sherman to the left bursts into flame. The Churchill's armor rings with the clang of a ricochet. Driver, advance! Target that lead tank! Avery swings the gun. The 75mm shell smashes into the Panzer's front plate. A glancing hit. The German returns fire, but the shell fails to penetrate. Redford's heart pounds. Another shot, closer this time. Sparks shower across the armor. Load AP, the loader, Private Jenkins, slams a shell into the breech. Up! Fire! The gun erupts again, and this time the Panzer shudders. Flames lick from its engine deck. Through the smoke, Redford watches the enemy crew scramble out. For a brief second, pity flickers. Then the Churchill lurches forward again. In the chaos, the slowest tank on the battlefield is doing what few expected. It's surviving. The Panzers can't flank it in the mud, can't outpace it in the hedgerows. Each time the Germans think they've cornered it, the Churchill's wide tracks pull it free. Its armor shrugs off hits that would turn lighter tanks into burning coffins. As dusk falls over the ruined fields of Shoe, Redford's crew is exhausted but alive. Around them, the muddy plain is littered with burned-out vehicles, German and Allied alike. Yet the Churchills keep moving, engines growling low, like beasts in the dark. For the first time, the British tankers begin to believe what few dared to say aloud, that maybe, just maybe, this lumbering machine wasn't a mistake after all. In the mud and blood of Normandy, the slowest tank has found its war. The next morning, the fields of Shoe were silent except for the groan of damaged engines and the distant rumble of artillery. A thin mist hung over the hedgerows, mingling with the acrid stench of fuel and burning rubber. The Churchills of the 7th Royal Tank Regiment rested in a battered orchard, their armor streaked with mud and soot, their crews slumped against the steel hulls. Lieutenant Redford climbed down from his turret, his boots sinking into the mud with a soft squelch. He lit a cigarette with trembling hands, the flame briefly illuminating his mud-smeared face. Around him, mechanics worked quietly, tightening bolts, checking tracks, patching holes in the armor with makeshift plates. Every man knew what was coming. This was only the beginning. Operation Epsom was far from over. Beyond the hedgerows, the German 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend was preparing a counterattack. Young men, some barely 18, armed with deadly machines, fanatically determined to push the Allies back into the sea. Redford had heard the rumors. The Germans were massing armor near Hill 112, one of the key high points controlling the approaches to Caen. Whoever held it could dominate the entire region. As dawn broke, the radio crackled to life with a clipped voice from Brigade Command. All units, prepare to advance. Objective, Hill 1-12. Expect heavy opposition. Ernie groaned inside the Churchill. You heard him, sir. Back into the mud we go. Just another day in paradise, Redford muttered, climbing back into his seat. Inside the tank, the air was thick with oil fumes. The men knew their roles instinctively now. Gunner, loader, driver, commander. A rhythm born of exhaustion and survival. When the order came, Ernie released the clutch, and the tank lurched forward once more. The approach to Hill 112 was brutal. The fields were cratered from artillery, the hedgerows shredded by mortars. Every few hundred yards, they passed the burned-out skeletons of Shermans and Cromwells, grim reminders of what waited ahead. The rain had returned, turning everything into a sucking morass. Where most tanks might bog down, the Churchill plowed onward, its massive tracks biting deep into the mud. A shell exploded nearby, showering the tank in mud and shrapnel. Inside, Jenkins flinched. That was close. Keep your head down, Redford barked. Avery, see if you can spot where that came from. Through the periscope, Avery scanned the tree line ahead. Then he saw it, the unmistakable outline of a Jagdpanzer I-4, its long 75-millimeter gun barrel glinting in the morning light. There, 200 meters, right of that hedgerow. Redford didn't hesitate. Fire! The Churchill's gun thundered. The round slammed into the German assault gun's front plate, denting it but failing to penetrate. The enemy returned fire, a sharp, ear-splitting crack, the shell striking the Churchill's turret and glancing off with a deafening clang. AP again. Load fast! Jenkins slammed another shell into the breech, sweat dripping down his face. The next shot hit lower, tearing through the Jagdpanzer's mantlet. Flames burst from its hatches. A moment later, the German machine was a torch. Inside the Churchill, no one cheered. There was only relief, and the grim understanding that there would be more, always more. As they pressed forward, the ground grew worse. The tank tilted dangerously as it crossed a shell crater. Mud poured over the tracks like liquid tar. At times, the Churchill seemed to pause, straining, before heaving itself free with a roar. Redford glanced through his periscope and saw Sherman's stuck in the distance, immobilized, vulnerable. The Churchill was slow, yes, but it was unstoppable. "Sir," Ernie called, "we've got infantry waving us down ahead." Through the mist, figures emerged. Weary Scottish soldiers, their uniforms caked in filth. One of them, a young sergeant, ran up to the tank and pounded the hull. "German machine gun nest, left field," he shouted. "We can't move up without support." Redford nodded. "Avery," he rounds. "Ernie, bring us left." The tank groaned as it turned. Avery adjusted the sights, his breath steady despite the chaos. The shell fired. A burst of flame, a shattering explosion, and the hedgerow erupted in smoke. Screams followed, brief and distant. The infantry moved forward again, shouting their thanks. By midday, the advance slowed to a crawl. Hill 1 to 12 loomed ahead, its slopes crawling with German armor. Redford's headset crackled. A warning from command. Enemy Tigers spotted near the crest. Repeat, enemy Tigers on the high ground. Every man in the Churchill froze. The Tiger I, the beast of the battlefield, its 88-millimeter gun could punch through a Sherman at over 2 kilometers. Even the Churchill's thick armor was vulnerable at close range. "Bloody hell," muttered Jenkins. "And we're supposed to fight that?" Redford exhaled slowly. "We're not running now." The Churchills dug in at the base of the hill, their engines idling as gunners scanned the ridgeline. Rain fell harder, turning the world gray and miserable. In that mud, even the mighty Tigers struggled to move. Redford smiled grimly to himself. The same ground that slowed the Churchills would trap the Germans too. When the first Tiger appeared, its massive silhouette emerging from the mist, every man on the British line felt it. A ripple of fear and awe. But this time, the slow tank had the advantage. Hidden in the mud, low and steady, the Churchill fired first. Its round hit the Tiger's tracks, shearing them clean off. The German machine shuddered, stuck fast in the muck. Another hit. Now! The second shell tore into the Tiger's side. Flames erupted from its turret. A cheer went up across the line. Brief, defiant, human. That day, Hill 1 to 12 did not fall. The Germans counterattacked again and again, but the Churchills held their ground, their armor scarred and pitted, their crews battered but unbroken. The slow tank had become the wall upon which the German assault shattered. As night fell and the rain eased, Redford leaned back in his seat, listening to the cooling engine tick and hiss. He thought of how many had mocked this tank. Too heavy, too slow, outdated before it even saw combat. But here, in the fields of Normandy, it was proving something the designers might never have imagined. That sometimes survival is the greatest weapon of all. July 1st, 1944. The battle for Hill 112 raged on, a grinding, endless duel of artillery, mud, and iron. The 7th Royal Tank Regiment had been in constant action for nearly a week. Their machines looked like moving ruins, armor blackened by smoke, skirts dented and torn, their once olive paint hidden beneath layers of filth. But they were still moving, still fighting, and in this corner of Normandy, that alone meant victory. The morning began with a fog so dense that visibility barely stretched beyond a few meters. To the Germans, it was an opportunity. To the British, it was a curse. Sound became everything. The metallic growl of engines, the faint clicking of treads, the soft thump of distant artillery, all mixed into an eerie symphony that hung over the fields. Inside Redford's Churchill, the crew waited in tense silence. The fog made it impossible to see, impossible to know whether the next sound was friendly or fatal. Then came the crunch of branches to the right. Slow, deliberate, heavy. "Contact," whispered Avery, his voice barely audible over the rumble of the idling engine. Through the periscope, Redford strained his eyes, and there it was, a shadow moving through the mist, the unmistakable squared-off silhouette of a Panzer IV. The German tank had wandered too close, unaware of the Churchill lurking just beyond the hedge. "Hold fire," Redford whispered. "Wait until he turns his turret." The seconds crawled by. The Panzer stopped, turning slightly as its barrel shifted toward a nearby field. That was the moment. Fire! The Churchill's gun erupted with a flash that split the fog. The shell smashed into the Panzer's flank, sending armor plates flying. It burned instantly, flames licking through the mist. The explosion's echo rolled through the hedgerows, and suddenly the whole line came alive. Gunfire erupted from every direction. Multiple contacts. Avery shouted. "Two more Panzers! Left flank! Reverse! Find cover!" Ernie threw the tank into reverse, the gears grinding as mud splattered across the vision blocks. Machine gun rounds rattled against the armor like hail. The loader, Jenkins, slammed another shell into the breach, breathing hard, his hands trembling. "Up! Fire!" The gun boomed again, and another Panzer was hit, not destroyed, but crippled. Its turret jammed, smoke billowing from the engine deck. The Churchill backed into a depression between hedgerows, becoming an unseen beast in the mud. "Keep low. Let them come to us," Redford ordered. For several minutes, there was only silence again, broken by the hiss of steam from the overheated engine. Then, faintly, the sound of tracks. Closer this time, more of them. Redford realized what was happening. The Germans weren't retreating. They were hunting, and yet, in this dense terrain, the hunters had become blind. Redford reached for the radio. "All Churchills, hold position and fire on muzzle flash. Make them show themselves." The fog lit up in bursts of light. Orange flares of gunfire flashing briefly before being swallowed by the gray. Each flash drew the attention of British guns. The Churchills responded in kind, shells tearing through the mist. It was chaos, a ghostly, close-quarters brawl in which no one could see beyond 20 meters. When the fog finally began to lift, the scene was apocalyptic. The hedgerows were shredded, trees torn apart, the fields littered with burning wrecks. The German counterattack had been stopped cold. The British infantry advanced cautiously, moving between hulking carcasses of tanks, both Allied and Axis. Redford climbed from his turret to take stock. His legs ached, his face was smeared with oil and soot, and yet he smiled faintly. For all their reputation, the German tanks couldn't cope with this terrain. The Churchills, with their low gearing and wide tracks, had turned the battlefield itself into a weapon. As the day wore on, news filtered through the ranks. Other regiments, the 31st Tank Brigade, the Guards Armored, had similar stories. Churchills holding ground where faster tanks faltered. Churchills climbing inclines the Shermans couldn't manage. Churchills surviving direct hits that would have gutted any other Allied machine. But the cost was brutal. Each victory came at the price of attrition. Crews lost, machines abandoned, engines burnt out from overwork. The 7th Royal Tank Regiment was down to barely half its original strength. Late that evening, while the men rested near a small stone farmhouse, Redford joined a group of infantry officers by a dying fire. Rain pattered softly on the tin helmets stacked beside them. One of the infantrymen, a tired young sergeant, gestured toward the looming shape of a Churchill in the distance. "Never thought I'd see the day I'd be glad to have those things around," he said. "They move like old cows, but by God, they don't die." Redford chuckled quietly. "Aye, she's not pretty, and she's not quick. But she'll get you home." Another officer leaned forward, his expression somber. "You know what Jerry calls them now? Stahlkröte, the steel-toed, slow, ugly, and impossible to kill." The men laughed, but there was pride in it. The nickname would stick. That night, as Redford lay on the cold ground beside his tank, he thought of all the stories he'd heard before coming to Normandy. About how British tanks were inferior, outdated, doomed to fail against German engineering. And yet, here they were, standing their ground, inching forward, dragging victory out of the mud, one hedgerow at a time. The Churchill had been designed for a different war. A war of trench lines and fortresses that never came. But in the hedgerow country of Normandy, it had found its destiny. Tomorrow would bring more fighting, more mud, more loss. But for tonight, under the dim glow of distant fires, the men of the 7th Royal Tank Regiment slept beside the slow, rumbling monsters that had become their saviors. July 10th, 1944. Dawn broke over Hill 112 beneath a sky bruised with cloud. The earth was soaked and raw, cratered, blackened, alive with smoke that drifted like ghostly fog through the wheat. The battle for the hill had dragged on for nearly 2 weeks, a brutal deadlock of armor and artillery. For both sides, it had become more than a strategic point. It was a test of will. The Churchills of the 7th Royal Tank Regiment had been refueled and patched through the night. Their armor bore scars that told the story of every shell, every ricochet, every desperate push. Inside Redford's tank, the crew moved mechanically, exhausted, hollow-eyed, but efficient. The familiar stench of cordite and oil filled the cramped space as Jenkins stacked shells, each one handled like a prayer. At 0600, the order came: advance and hold. The infantry would move in behind the armor. German counterattacks were expected. No one said it aloud, but every man knew what that meant. Once you went forward, you didn't come back until the ground itself stopped fighting. "All right, lads," Redford said quietly over the intercom. "Let's show them what slow looks like." The tank shuddered to life. Ernie coaxed it forward, the Churchill's tracks grinding through the mud like stubborn jaws chewing through rock. Around them, other Churchills moved in staggered formation, lumbering silhouettes in the mist. To their flanks, Sherman Fireflies advanced cautiously, their longer 17-pounder guns gleaming wet in the gray light. Then came the sound that froze every man in his seat. The deep, heavy thunder of an 88mm gun firing from the ridge. The first shell landed short, throwing a fountain of dirt into the air. The second screamed over their heads, exploding somewhere behind them. "Keep moving," Redford barked. "Don't give him a still target." The tank lurched forward as Avery scanned the ridge through his sights. "There! Near the orchard! Tiger! Hull down!" "AP loaded," shouted Jenkins. "Range 300! On target! Fire!" The Churchill's gun roared, the shell streaking across the wet air and striking the Tiger's mantlet with a shriek of metal. The impact left a glowing scar but didn't penetrate. The Tiger returned fire instantly. Its shell slammed into the Churchill's front plate, shaking the entire crew like dice in a cup. "Hit, but no breach," Jenkins shouted. "Bloody hell, we're still alive." Redford gritted his teeth. "Again! Aim for the tracks!" The next round landed lower, just beneath the German tank's side armor. The explosion sent mud and steel fragments flying. The Tiger rocked, its left tread collapsing into the muck. Immobilized, it fired one last desperate shot before smoke began to pour from its turret. A ragged cheer filled the intercom. "Good shooting, Avery. Let's finish it." They fired again. The Tiger burned, but there was no time to celebrate. From the tree line ahead came another danger. German infantry with Panzerfausts moving in fast. The Churchills opened up with their Besa machine guns, stitching the hedgerows with tracer fire. The gunners of the supporting infantry added their rifles to the cacophony. Men fell, disappeared into the mud. The advance continued yard by yard, the Churchills grinding forward through a storm of fire. Mortar shells rained down, bursting against the soft earth. The concussion inside the tank was deafening. Every explosion rattled through the steel like a drumbeat. "Driver, pivot left! Avery, suppress that ridge!" "On it!" The gun boomed again. A German half-track exploded in a burst of flame and shrapnel. The air stank of burning rubber and cordite. By midday, the 7th Royal Tank Regiment reached the lower slopes of Hill 112. The landscape looked like the surface of another planet. Trees splintered into jagged stumps, ground pocked with shell craters, smoke curling from the wreckage of both British and German machines. Over the radio, the voice of Brigade Command broke through the static. "All units, hold your positions. Reinforcements delayed. Expect counterattack within the hour." Redford sighed. Of course they are. They dug in along a line of shattered hedgerows, their tanks positioned hull down, guns trained on the slopes above. Rain began to fall again. Soft at first, then relentless. It turned the ash and blood into a slurry that ran between the treads. An hour later, the counterattack came. From the far ridge, the Germans descended. Panthers, Panzer IVs, infantry in gray, advancing through smoke and fire. Artillery from both sides filled the sky with screaming metal. The ground trembled as shells fell around the Churchills. "Hold your fire," Redford yelled. "Wait until they're in range." The men waited, hearts pounding. Through the periscope, the German tanks grew larger, sleek, fast, deadly. Now, the first salvo from the Churchills lit the hillside. AP shells tore into the lead Panthers, one bursting into flame, another spinning sideways with its turret blown off. The others pressed on, returning fire. One Churchill took a direct hit. Its armor buckled, flames bursting from the hatches. Redford's crew watched in silence as men scrambled free from the inferno. The battle raged for an hour that felt like a lifetime. When the smoke cleared, the hill was littered with wreckage. Both sides had been mauled, but the Churchills still stood, their engines idling like beasts too stubborn to die. That night, rain continued to fall. The men of the 7th Royal Tank Regiment sat on their tanks, eating cold rations under ponchos, too tired to speak. The fires on the ridge burned through the night, flickering like funeral pyres across the horizon. In the darkness, Redford stared at the battered silhouette of his tank. Its armor was dented and pocked with shrapnel, its paint almost entirely stripped away. And yet, it had carried them through every hour, every bombardment, every impossible push. He thought of how many had called it obsolete, how many sneered at its slow speed and awkward bulk. But here, in the killing fields of Normandy, speed meant nothing. Power meant nothing. Only endurance did. The Churchill wasn't a predator. It wasn't a panther or a tiger. It was a survivor. And in this war, that made it a nightmare no German commander could ever forget. July 11th, 1944. The fields of Normandy were quiet again, if only for a moment. Smoke drifted low across Hill 112, curling between blackened trees and the twisted hulks of tanks that now dotted the slopes like monuments to destruction. The rain had finally stopped. The air smelled of oil, wet soil, and cordite, the scent of survival. Lieutenant Alan Redford stood outside his Churchill, helmet in hand, watching the dawn spread pale light over the battlefield. Around him, the ground was alive with the movement of recovery crews, stretcher-bearers, and engineers. The silence felt almost sacred, the kind of silence that only comes after men have fought the world to a standstill. His tank, the same Churchill that had clawed through hedgerows, outlasted ambushes, and survived direct hits from Tigers, sat immovable behind him, streaked with mud and burn marks. One of the mechanics ran a hand along its scarred armor and shook his head in disbelief. "Can't believe she's still running, sir. We welded half her hull together 2 days ago." Redford smiled faintly. "She doesn't know when to quit." Nearby, other crews gathered for roll call. Faces were missing, familiar voices replaced by silence. The 7th Royal Tank Regiment had lost nearly a third of its strength during the fighting for Hill 1 to 12. And yet, they held it. The Germans had thrown everything they had at that ridge, and it still stood under British boots. Reports came in through the morning. Entire German armored companies had been destroyed. Many of their vaunted Panthers and Tigers lay gutted in the fields, victims not of speed or cunning, but of the one thing the Churchills had in abundance: persistence. The men had begun to notice something strange. The German attacks were slowing. Their confidence was cracking. Where once the sight of a tiger sent shivers down every Allied spine, now the crews spoke of them differently, as prey that could be cornered, trapped, outlasted. The battlefield had changed, and the Churchill had helped change it. At noon, Redford's unit was ordered to pull back for rest and refit. The tanks moved in a slow procession down the ruined roads of Normandy. Civilians peeked from shattered doorways, watching the massive machines roll by, slow, scarred, but triumphant. A small girl, barefoot and wide-eyed, waved as the column passed. Jenkins, the loader, leaned out and tossed her a ration tin. She smiled, clutching it like treasure. The convoy halted near a makeshift supply depot, little more than a few tents and fuel drums scattered across what used to be a meadow. Mechanics swarmed over the tanks, patching holes and replacing treads. Redford walked among them, his uniform stiff with dried mud, his mind still replaying the battle. An older officer, Colonel Marcus Deering, approached him. "Redford," he said, his voice gruff but measured. "I've read your after-action report. Damned good work up there. Your tank alone accounted for 3 Panzers and a Tiger." Redford nodded. "We just kept moving, sir. The mud did half the job." Deering chuckled. "That's the thing about this war. Everyone wanted speed. Fast tanks, fast victories. But out there, speed's useless if you can't stay alive. The Churchill's slow, yes, but she stays alive. And that, Lieutenant, is what wins wars." The words stayed with Redford long after the colonel left. He looked over at his tank again, the same machine that soldiers once joked about as a relic, a mechanical dinosaur. Yet in the crucible of Normandy, it had earned a new reputation. The Germans called it der Sumpfpanzer, the swamp tank. To them, it was a ghost that crawled through mud and fire, appearing where nothing should move, shrugging off hits that should kill. As the weeks passed and the front shifted south toward Falaise, the legend grew. Reports spread through the ranks of Churchills, climbing slopes too steep for other tanks, pulling stranded Shermans free from ditches, crossing bombed-out bridges that looked impossible. There was even talk of one Churchill surviving over 20 direct hits before finally being retired. Its armor warped, its engine dead, but its crew alive. For the men who fought in them, the Churchills became more than machines. They were lifeboats made of steel, their slow pace a strange comfort in the storm of battle. When the shells came down, when the roads turned to rivers of mud, when everything else failed, the Churchills kept crawling. By August 1944, as the Allies finally broke through and began the dash across France, many of those same crews looked back on Normandy with something close to awe. The fields, once soaked in rain and blood, had tested every machine and every man. And in that test, the Churchill, Britain's slowest tank, had proven faster than anything else in the only way that mattered. It had outlasted the enemy. Months later, when the war moved into Belgium, Redford's unit was refitted with newer models. The Churchills were upgraded. Thicker armor, better guns, flamethrower variants, bridge layers. Each adaptation a testament to a design that refused to die. The men joked that the tank had evolved the way soldiers did, by surviving everything the world could throw at it. But Redford never forgot the original. On quiet nights, when the engines were cold and the world finally still, he would remember the sound, that deep, slow growl of the engine pushing through the mud of Normandy, the rhythm of survival. Years after the war, he would visit a museum in Bovington, where an old Churchill sat silent beneath the hangar lights, the same model he'd commanded. Its paint restored, its scars covered. Children climbed its hull, laughing. He stood before it for a long time, running his hand along the cold steel, feeling the ghost of vibration beneath his palm. It wasn't a beautiful machine. It never had been. But it was honest. It was British, stubborn, solid, imperfect, and unyielding. And on those wet fields of Normandy, that was enough. As he turned to leave, he whispered softly, not to the tank, but to the memory of those who had trusted their lives to its armor. You were never slow, he said. You were steady. Outside, rain began to fall again, faintly pattering on the museum roof, like the echo of mud hitting armor. Somewhere far away, long ago, in that rhythm, the story of Britain's slowest tank endures, not as a relic of the past, but as a reminder that sometimes survival itself is the greatest act of defiance.